talking about PreModern with MTG Banding.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
This episode is supported by our Durdle Maniacs, who enjoy ad-free content as well as bonus content that can be found either on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. If you're thinking about supporting the show, we'd really appreciate it, and you can find us on any of those mediums. What it do? Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me this week, Phil Nguyen of MTG Banding for PreModern. So we're going to be talking about PreModern today. Phil, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, there's this IT disaster going on today.
Oh my God.
But, Eternal Durdles is above all that. We have the infrastructure that we could keep going. So we're still recording.
Nothing's happened at the airport today on my end because of that.
Well, that's because you have a private jet, so you don't need to deal with all that other nonsense.
It's actually a Goblin war kite.
Exactly.
As opposed to, say, a Goblin flotilla or,
the Balloon Brigade.
Or a Balloon Brigade. Exactly. Yes. If you're one of those fancier goblins, you have a Balloon Brigade. But what I wanted to do is I kind of wanted to, for the layman, for people who are just getting in or who are just excited about Lobstercon, and want to know what's going on with PreModern, I wanted to split this into three sections. One, I wanted to talk about the pillars of the format. We talk about that a lot for Legacy. And I think there are some pillars of the format for PreModern as well. And then I want to talk about the decks, the top tier decks, what we would expect to see at Lobstercon. And then I want to go into your brand, MTG Banding, which it's all PreModern. It's a whole PreModern Substack that you rock.
Yeah, sounds good.
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like PreModern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
All right. Thanks again for having me on. So let's get started.
Yeah, so let's talk about the pillars of PreModern. I mean, I have in my head kind of what some of the pillars would be, but if you were to break it down into compare it to Legacy, what are the pillars of the format like?
Yeah, so just to get started, I know that some of the viewers probably are already familiar with PreModern, but it's a format that basically covers from 1995 to 2003, and it's been around for a decent amount of time. It was founded in 2012, so it's like 12 years ago now, and it really has picked up a lot of steam, especially during COVID lockdowns. It has a pretty big webcam community, and so that's where a lot of the leagues started. And so, like any format, PreModern has kind of like a set of cards and a set of decks that are kind of considered staples or pillars of the format. I think as far as PreModern goes, despite it being a fixed format, fixed card pool, it actually has seen quite a bit of change.
Yeah, agreed.
I started playing in, I think it was 2018. And when I started, there was basically like four main decks that were considered the best decks in the format. It was like Goblins, Burn, Landstill, and the Rock. Those were like basically the top decks. Everyone was preparing for those decks. And these days, as more people have played the format, more cards and strategies have been tried out, it looks a little bit different now. And so these days, I would say like the top decks that people are seeing are kind of like a Terravore Ponza deck of different flavors, generally like green-red or green-white, which basically uses Terravore and Oath of Druids. Is a very popular deck. Goblins is still very strong, depending on utilizing a turn one Goblin Lackey is very powerful, and it's very grindy as well because it can have starts with Goblin Ringleader and Goblin Matron to keep the party going. So those two are very popular. I would say that Stiflenought is another one of those very popular decks that's very strong in the format. Burn is still very strong as well. And then these days there's kind of like a variety of other decks that are like, depending on who you ask, like tier 1 decks that you'll see. Replenish has become exceptionally popular as a kind of the combo deck of choice. So that's a really strong one. Elves, using survival of the fittest is also very strong. There was a period in time in which it was considered far and away the best deck, but I think that has receded slightly, but still exceptionally strong. And so I would say that those are kind of like the main popular decks. As far as like I guess pillars of the format in terms of cards go, I'll just name a couple that I haven't already, but like Oath of Druids, Survival of the Fittest,
Yeah.
Gush Engines, Swords to Plowshares, very, very strong. Standstill is still seen a little bit. And so like I think like a lot of those cards, Dark Rituals is seen a little bit, but also not as much as it used to be. But there's still a lot of powerful cards that are commonly seen.
Yeah, because when you think about like the pillars of legacy, right? You're thinking like, okay, yeah, you have your like Lion's Eye Diamond decks, you have your
Yeah.
Brainstorm decks, and I feel like yeah, in pre-modern, it's like you have decks that are like Lightning Bolt decks, you have Survival of the Fittest decks, you have Swords to Plowshare decks,
Yeah.
and and then Oath of Druids and stuff like that. But those are the cards like if a deck is playing that color, they're almost guaranteed to be playing that card, right? Like that's kind of
Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
that's how I think of like card pillars, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like basically you can take you basically look at the legacy ban list and then you compare it to what's legal in pre-modern. And if it's legal in pre-modern and banned in legacy, it's probably gonna be a
Yes.
pillar of the format. And so that's why, yeah, like you said, like Gush, Oath of Druids and Survival are very popular.
Yeah. And then one deck that you didn't mention, and I wonder if it's fallen off, is Psychatog. Is Psychatog still up there?
Yeah, I mean, classic blue-black psychatog has kind of always been like a tier two-ish deck. It was actually the second deck that I built in pre-modern, the first deck being Trix, one of my all-time favorite decks.
Classic.
Yeah, and Psychatog I think is a strong deck. It uses Gush, so it already covers like one of the pillars of the format. But I think one of the main weaknesses of it is that it's actually always had trouble with red decks that are able to apply a lot of pressure pretty quickly. So like Burn and Goblins in particular. And in a lot of ways, Psychatog I think became less popular when Stiflenought became a little bit more developed.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, you're kind of relying on this control suite and to control the game, and then you kind of have one big creature that you're hoping to finish it off with. But Stiflenought is a lot more proactive. Like you can get it out turn one or turn two, and Psychatog is a little bit slower and also graveyard dependent. And so I think in that regard, it's fallen off a little bit, but there are still some people who have put in a lot of effort into it. There's Tom Metelsky, who has put in a lot of work into it. One of his main innovations has been to put in zombie infestation in the sideboard, because he feels like it helps address some of the weaknesses of the red decks. There's another great player, Iñaki in Spain, who's also been working on Psychatog for a very long time, who has been kind of like trying out new things. And so I think there's still some diehard players that have innovated with it. I'll finish off by saying that Psychatog is still seen in like Growtog, which
Yeah.
is I think becoming more popular because based here in New York, Lenny Huang, who hosts Spike Colony, the podcast covering pre-modern, has put in a lot of work into Growtog, and so I think that's been seeing some more popularity. And then also there's a blue-black Stiflenought variant that uses Psychatog as kind
Yeah.
of like an alternate win condition, and so that one is also like a home for Psychatog too.
Fair. All right. Well, so I mean, I'm not going to ask you to against your will necessarily to tell us what you're going to be taking to Lobstercon, but I'm taking a deck that hasn't really seen any competitive play in
Amazing.
probably since the beginning of the format. Right. I'm
Yeah.
going with Cadaverous Bloom, Prost
Amazing.
Bloom.
Yeah. That's I mean, I'll have to talk to you later about it. There's this one guy, Flippy, based in Germany. He is best known for this deck called Blue White Flippy, which is essentially built off of Rebels, and then he quickly innovated and like evolved it into like a completely different deck. Anyway, he has been working on like kind of like a Cadaverous Bloom type deck, and so it's been pretty cool to see. It's definitely very complicated. I think I tagged you in that one Twitter
Yeah,
post
you
about
did.
this like
Yeah,
insane puzzle, but it's definitely like a great and fun deck. I remember playing against you once at a meetup.
yeah. That's one of those decks where like you kind of just like put everything into the hands of fate.
Yeah,
There's not a whole lot of counterplay. It's like either you get it or your opponent stops you from getting it.
yeah.
And if you do, great, you win. If your opponent plays like meddling mage and just names like drain life, you can just lose the game immediately.
Yeah, I mean, Meddling Mage is an insane card
Yeah.
for us combo players. But yeah, I mean, last year at Lobstercon, which hosts the North American PreModern Championships, it was 186 players last year, and at the time, it was the largest in-person PreModern event. And last year, I brought kind of my own brew. It was kind of like I call it like Raging Glaciers, but it's essentially mono red control, and then I put in Oath of Druids into it.
Oh, sort of like
I went
a big red situation.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it didn't really have any ramp or anything like that,
Okay.
or that much land destruction. But basically, you use thawing glaciers to make sure that you
Yeah.
keep making land drops, and then eventually, casting two Urza's Rages kicked. And so,
Nice.
yeah, it was pretty sweet. It went 4-2-1. I had to leave early and miss the last round to catch a flight back to New York. But this year, I actually haven't decided on a deck yet.
Okay.
I really like the red deck, but the thing about red decks is that there's like so much incidental hate between red
Yeah.
and blue decks. Like everyone, like no matter what deck you're gonna play, you're gonna find a way to jam like chill or hydroblast stuff like that, and then every red
Warmth.
deck, yeah, exactly, or cop red.
Yeah.
And so
Top
that's
red. Oh,
yeah. The
disgusting.
funny thing though is that Urza's Rage goes through Cop Red, so
Yeah.
that's fun. Yeah, that's the thing is that like a lot of red decks right now are just facing so much hate, and then red decks are also super popular because Burn and Goblins are some of the two most popular decks, and so I'm just like I don't know if I want to play a red deck, just because I think there'll be a lot of hate for it.
Yeah. Something out there for people who are thinking about the metagame and what they want to do. As a devout like Ice Age like enthusiast, I came in like in between Ice Age and Fallen Empires. Um, a card that people should think about if they want to get around those like warmth effects or cop red is Ghostly Flame. It
Colorless
costs
sources,
one
yeah.
black and one red, and it makes all of your red spells colorless, I believe. Or is it red spells colorless?
I
Maybe it's red or black spells.
Yeah, because it's black and red for the enchantment. Because I remember I started around Ice Age, and I remember pulling that card. It has this like sweet art of this like flame dude in like a ring or
Yeah.
something,
Oh
right?
yeah. It's like if the guy from Street Fighter was like, oh no, and he got up. Like after he's like, you Hadouken him, and he's like,
Yeah,
ah. It's like if he got up and was like, all right, well, I guess I'm still fighting.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
both
man,
red and black spells, permanents and spells are considered colorless sources of damage.
that is sweet. I
So
mean,
it's not just spells; it's your creatures too.
that is sweet. I mean, like I have definitely lost to Dralnu's Crusade quite a bit of times, which is kind of similar. It's 3 mana, but it's all goblins get +1/+1, and then they become black and are zombies in
Oh
addition
yeah,
to their creature type, and so that gets around all like the red
yeah,
effects
cop
too.
red and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so that one's pretty sweet.
So I have here. I haven't updated my list on Moxfield for a minute. Shout out to Moxfield as a show sponsor. But I think what would be kind of fun is I have looks like about 16 decks here. You can tell me whether or not they are still playable, like competitive. Let's say
Yeah.
playable is obviously subjective in this format. But all right. So we have a blue red control with frenetic Efreet and chance encounter.
Ooh, I do love that deck.
The splinter twin of the format, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's it's funny because I've tried building that deck a few times, and some of the cards have had a lot of price spikes because of like commander cards. I would say that I would not bring it to a competitive event, because it does revolve around a 4 mana enchantment that has to stick the turn. through a full turn cycle, and I think that is hard.
Rough.
Yeah, blue-red control though is not bad, and blue-red Stiflenought is also pretty good too, I think. So but yeah, I guess I would not bring it to a
Okay.
competitive event.
Trix, you're a deck we've both played. Trix is, by the way, for the layman here, for the person not aware of the naming convention of decks back in like 2003, everything was named after a breakfast cereal. It had nothing to do with the deck. Trix is Illusions of Grandeur Donate. So you gain 20 and then pass this to your opponent. It's got, when it leaves the battlefield, you lose 20 life and it has a cumulative upkeep of 2 colorless mana. So you just would donate 20 damage to your opponent.
Yeah. Unfortunately, another deck that I would not bring these days.
Fair.
Because,
yeah.
I think it actually was a little bit better earlier on, but these days in the last couple of years, people are packing more main deck disenchant hate.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And
that's real bad.
And you can disenchant the illusions when it's
on the stack.
Yeah, when the trigger's on the stack, and then you basically lose.
Yeah.
Though that being said, Andy Culpepper has been working on a kind of like a Trix Tide deck, I believe, which is pretty cool because Tide can help clear the way, and obviously if you're removing your opponent's lands, they have a lot harder of a time to pay the upkeep.
It's a good juke too, because they might think you're on the Replenish deck instead and start trying to prepare for that, siding in Cabal, Stromgold Cabal or something like that,
Yeah, and some people have played it with Dream Halls too.
Oh yeah,
as kind of like a finisher, which is pretty cool.
That's actually a great idea. Dream Halls in that deck because you can just do the thing all in one turn.
Yeah, and you can also pitch dead cards. Like if you have like 3 donates in hand, then you don't
need donate. You only need 1 donate, unless your opponent's rocking an Ebony Charm, and then you're in trouble. That was the deck back in the day. Back when this was an extended deck. Is like you would play like 3 Ebony Charms in your sideboard and be like, all right, well I'll just gain 1 life and you'll lose 1 life.
That's amazing.
All right, Suicide Black. That's the Dothy Slayers and Phyrexian Negators, Carnophages, Hatred.
Yeah, I think it's an okay deck. I think in general the problem is that you're not doing anything inherently unfair.
Yeah,
you're kind of just trying to like beat down face pretty direct.
Hatred's kind of unfair.
It is, but it's
just
super risky.
To burn.
Yeah. I think it's like an okay deck. It's not bad, but I think there's probably more powerful things you can be doing if you want to be in like a mono black color.
That's fair. Esper Stiflenought.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, Stiflenought has gone through a lot of iterations. The Esper version was actually at one point the de facto version.
That's when I made this 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Enlightened Tutor is the reason why you're playing that. I guess it's as well as Meddling Mage.
Yeah, I think it's still good. I mean, honestly, like any Stiflenought list is still good. I think the value of Enlightened Tutor has gone down because I think people are starting to value, card advantage, and having you spend a card to Enlightened Tutor and then have whatever you're having get disenchanted or naturalized is a pretty feel bad moment. But that being said, like if I had to go to a tournament and brought Esper Stiflenought, I'd probably feel okay about it.
Stasis.
Stasis, I think, is actually still pretty good. One of the toughest matchups for Stasis traditionally has been Elves, because Quirion Ranger basically nullifies your entire strategy. But that being said, Elves has kind of taken a step back in terms of the amount of playtime it's had. It's kind of complicated. It's still a very good deck, but I think Stasis is not a bad choice. Some people have been grinding it out on MTGO with different strategies, and I think it's still a pretty decent deck.
You can always hibernate your opponent's green guys, right?
Yeah, it's true. I think a lot of players are using Curse Totem as like the tech in the sideboard because Madness is another difficult deck because they apply pressure, they have counter magic, and they can always discard cards out of their hand.
Yeah.
So that they don't lose to Black Dice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it's like you have to win because, that deck doesn't even play Howling Mind like the old school deck plays.
Yeah.
You just I think you just lose.
Yeah.
You got to bounce that to your opponent's hand.
Exactly. And so that's why like Curse Totem is kind of like the default answer to those.
Of course, Sligh, mono red.
Still good.
Still a good deck. Are they
Still
still
good.
playing Ball Lightning?
Oh yeah, still
Yes.
playing Ball Lightning.
Awesome.
There's still like some debate going on about certain specific cards. Like for a while, people were debating about Urza's Bauble. Is like
Yeah.
some decks were playing that, some were not. Some people are talking about Curse Scroll versus Sulfuric Vortex
Okay.
or Lava Darts. It's kind of like different iterations, but they're all like kind of in the same realm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see what else we got here. So not the classic what do they call that? Full English breakfast, but like recurring survival.
Yeah, honestly, I've not seen that deck in a while. I have lost to it a few times
Yeah.
because like once you start recurring, Deranged Hermit or what have you, things get ugly really
Yeah,
fast.
Avalanche Riders, just like
Yeah.
yeah.
I would say that like survival decks in general are not bad.
Yeah.
I think that, survival has some shells that are probably more powerful for it, but not as fun, subjectively, right? But I think it's an okay deck. It's not great because, like I said, if you're playing survival, like Elves or like the Full English Breakfast version are probably stronger.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think Recurring Nightmare is such a fun card. So
Yeah. Landstill. How's Landstill been?
honestly, it's actually been doing pretty good. It's kind of interesting because, like I said, for a while it was considered the best deck.
Yeah.
People thought that Standstill, the card, was absolutely broken because, like, once you play it, it's really hard to play around. I think in time people have gotten better about understanding when to crack Standstill, and so that's helped it or helped people play better against it. But I think that there was, I guess, some people who thought that Landstill was not a very good deck because, in a lot of ways, it's not doing anything inherently unfair either, other than the standstill itself. And so some people compared it to like kind of the Rock. It's like a,
Yeah.
kind of a slower deck that's trying to control the board. It's kind of playing a fair game. But that being said, it's put up a decent amount of results because it just has a lot of tools. You just need to make sure that you're packing the right tools, and if your matchups line up pretty well, then it's still a solid deck.
Yeah.
So I think I'd feel okay bringing it to a tournament.
What about Doomsday? Speaking of Ebony Charms.
Yeah, that's like this deck is like the classic one where anyone who enters pre-modern is like, how does this deck even win? Because unlike modern formats, you can't just like play a Thassa's Oracle and just like win the game super easily. You really have to earn your victory with Doomsday.
Reoccur Ebony Charm an infinite number of times at one life against an entire format of people playing Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, and can't beat a Mog Fanatic is kind of like the joke that's not really a joke.
Yeah.
I think it's still a very strong deck, but I would probably not bring it to a competitive event, but I think it's actually pretty good.
Okay.
In the right hands, yeah.
What about, so this is a deck that that I requested from you.
Oh yeah?
This is it says I last updated this 4 months ago, which is wild for me to even think about. So I must have just looked at this 4 months ago. But distorted lens control.
Oh man.
We should talk about what this deck does.
Yeah, because I can kind of guess, but I would love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so Distorted Lens is a 2-mana artifact that taps to target permanent, becomes the color of your choice. And then you use Reap, and it returns any number of cards you control, cards from your graveyard to your hand. You cannot choose more cards than the number of black permanents. So the idea is to recur, to get at least 2 Distorted Lenses in play and start just recurring Reap and something else and just kind of running that over and over again. And then you have, I don't have the sideboard sitting in this deck for some reason. So you have Cunning Wish to get kind of bullets for the deck. It plays Helm of Awakening, Sunscape Familiar to lower the cost of the what's called Reap, Prismatic Lace, Intuition, Tinker, and it looks like I just don't know how this deck wins. Actually, I'm looking at this I have no idea. Do you just run your opponent out of cards because you have Reap?
Does this one play LED or Frantic
It
Search?
plays LED and it plays Frantic Search.
Okay, so some of the pre-modern people may know, but I've been running this like online Spice League, and basically it was this 8-week league. We're about to start the playoffs, but it was meant to kind of highlight and showcase kind of like brews or
Yeah,
spice underrepresented decks. And one of the decks that I played was a red-green Reap deck, and basically using Reap, you can generate infinite mana, and it requires so many cards and requires like cards across different zones, and so it's exceptionally vulnerable. But essentially, the combo involves having 2 Reap, 2 LEDs, and then your opponent having 2 or more black permanents. And so that way, you can essentially cast the LED and Reap, and bring back another Reap and LED, and you keep on looping that. And so each time you gain 1 colored mana, and then eventually you can win uh, through any number of ways because you basically have infinitely recurring cards and mana. So in my deck, I recurred Lightning Bolt,
this
and I would
this
just
deck looks like the one I have listed. Looks like it recurs Lodestone Bobble
yeah,
an infinite number of times to make your
yeah,
opponent lose on his upkeep.
yeah,
Because you
exactly.
can target them to basically like Lodestone Bobble is like a targeted Urza's Bobble, where like that the player that you target with it draws like does a slow trip.
Yeah,
That's so
exactly. And
rude.
so and actually the blue version has something else that it can do too, is if you have Sunscape Familiar or Helm of Awakening out and your spells cost 1 colorless less, then what you can do is you can loop Reap and Frantic Search, because Frantic Search will untap 3, but
Yeah,
your spells will cost less than 3. And so essentially you can loot through your entire deck
I
until
see.
you find the LED, and then you use the LED to loop for infinite mana. Then you can loop the Lodestone Bauble.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a
So
fun deck. What do you
anyway,
think? What do you think? Is that
yeah.
good enough to take to Lobstercon?
Honestly, it's untested, but the problem is that it requires the graveyard and artifacts in
Yeah.
play, and it's just like too many things happening. So I would probably not bring it to the main event, but there is like a day 2 side event that is a little bit more casual, and I would probably bring it to that just for some laughs.
All right, you won't hurt my feelings. Cadaverous Bloom, Cross Bloom.
Okay, so I think prior to playing against Flippy, and when I was playing against you, you did combo off a few times against me, so I definitely respect it when it goes off. Um, it does require a bit of setup, right, and some resources, but I don't know. When I was playing against Flippy, I felt like there was a glimmer of something there. And so like I don't think it's ready for prime time necessarily. If your goal is to like I must top 8 this tournament,
Yeah.
right? Then it's probably not ready. But I think that there could still be some progress made on the deck. I think the problem is that a lot of the cards are pretty expensive
Yeah.
randomly. And so like I don't think it's been brewed enough with yet, but I think maybe next year, we have this conversation again, and maybe my answer will be different.
Well, we'll see when I win the whole thing, right?
Yeah, when you win the whole thing, and we'll be like, "Wow, what a stupid
I
take,"
wonder what's the expensive stuff in here. Is it it's probably Meditate, right? No, Meditate's like
Uh,
$4.
no, yeah, I think the Cadaverous Bloom itself and the Squandered
Squandered
Resources.
Resources is $30. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
And then I had to have the specifically 5th edition uh, Cities of Brass for the deck, so that they
yeah,
also
to make it
aren't cheap.
time appropriate.
Yeah, yeah. And then also probably no Natural Bounce. This deck costs $600, which
Yeah.
isn't the worst. But okay. So then this is a pet deck of mine that it hasn't seen play for a long time. Browse Digger.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so I mentioned the Spice League earlier, and Andy Culpepper is he's like somewhat of a Magic historian in a
Yeah.
lot of ways too. Like he similar to you, he just loves Magic's history and like historical decks that people played, and he did play a Browse Digger deck in the Spice League, and I think he did win that match. And so it's not a deck that I'm super familiar with. I did have a browse growing up. It's like this orcish guy like tearing
Yeah, he's just
away.
like
Yeah.
ah.
Um, and so I'm not sure if I can say yes or no to it. It looks
It's
really
I mean it's
sweet.
basically a blue white control deck that plays because of the era that it was in. Played Wall of Air to stop Pump Knights and to
Yeah.
stop Sarah Angels, right? But the win condition was to just recur Jester's Cap over and over
Yeah.
again. So you start by taking all of the disenchants out of your opponent's deck, right? You're like,
Amazing.
great, now you can't get rid of my combo. And then like you're like, oh, and now I'll just start working on your threats. Okay, now all of your win conditions, and then you just get to a point where there's nothing they can do to stop you. But if they get rid of the Jester's Cap or stop your your diggers from
Yeah.
digging, you're in serious trouble. And this particular deck is playing like control magic because like that can be a win condition. Could you
That's
imagine
amazing.
control magicking somebody's like Stiflenought? So bad.
That would be such a great feeling. Yeah, I'm like looking at Andy's Browse Digger deck, and it looks like he wins by looping Time Warp with
Okay,
Gaia's
that's a
Blessings,
much
and
better idea, honestly.
yeah. So I don't know. It could be a dark horse pick.
Yeah.
Maybe.
All right, we've got two more decks, and they're basically the same deck, but so there's 4-color control without black, and there's 4-color control without white.
Uh,
So basically, undermine or absorb.
Absorb. Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Has
trying to
4-color
think.
control seen any play recently?
There was, I think at the Italian Nationals that happened like a week or two ago, I think that there was like a 3 or 4 color Oath deck, like Oath control deck,
Okay.
that I think top 8'd or top 4'd, something like that. And so it's possible, like, the problem with all these decks is that the mana is like terrible, right?
Yes. You got to
Um,
play like what is that card? Coliseum.
Grand Coliseum, yeah.
Grand Coliseum. Whoa. It's like a
Yeah.
bad when you're playing bad City of Brass and City of
Yeah.
Brass.
'Cause you're probably not in a good place.
No.
Honestly, like I would say no, but I think if you're lucky and you know what you're doing, it can be a good deck. Just because obviously you have the best cards in every color.
Yeah,
So
the blue the non-black version was sort of a staple of mine for a long time because it was just like everything you wanted to be doing,
Yeah.
in control. I remember to me, I also like the black version because you won through undermines, and there was a deck back in the day that was like it was a Sultai deck that you played undermine to get your opponent down to like 8,
Yeah.
right? And then you just won with Nether Spirit. You were just like, I'm just gonna get you with Nether Spirit eventually. Like you played
That's
like
sweet.
1 or 2 Nether Spirits in the deck, and you were just like, eventually you'll lose, and you'd play like contamination stuff, like just to like completely like
That's sweet.
get people out of the game.
Yeah, I mean, like Bug is my favorite color combination, and is very difficult to play in pre-modern because there's no enemy fetch lands.
Yeah.
Or enemy tap lands either. I don't think
you can do the Sky Shroud Forest, I believe, is one. It is a pain land that comes into play tapped.
Yeah. But yeah, like Contamination has seen a lot of play recently. There's like this mono black deck by Alvaro Galindo it's been pretty good, and some people have tried like Bug in like I think like a Bug Parallax Tide deck maybe.
Okay.
There's a lot of good cards, but it's always the mana, right?
Yeah.
So that's the hard part.
All right. Well, let's talk. Let's focus on MTG Banding a little bit because you have a Substack that goes out monthly and talks about basically does what we're doing right here, right? And talks about the format and kind of highlights the big events and stuff like that. And I suppose you're ramping up right now for Lobstercon.
Yeah, in a way. So this newsletter covers pre-modern. It's at mtgbanding.com, and basically, I write about different topics that I find interesting. Sometimes it's like interviews with players, or sometimes it's based on like what decks I'm playing. This latest issue was pretty interesting. It was based on kind of the meta data collected from recent large events. Um, and so when I published it, it contained three large events. There was a Duress Crew regional event that's based in Massachusetts. There's the Czech Champs, which had about 140 players. Spanish Nationals had about 220 players. I've since updated that with the South American Championships and the Italian Nationals as well. And it's been pretty interesting because basically I collected all the meta shares of the decks and then also compared it to the top 8 share. And I think that this kind of data could be useful if you're trying to figure out what to play at LobsterCon or another big event, just to see what other people are playing. We could dig into that a little bit more, but just to wrap up, yeah, I mean the newsletter has been pretty fun. What's great about PreModern is that things change a lot, but also like you're not inundated with new set releases all the
Yeah.
time. And so, I have twins and a job, and we're all adults and have like things going on all the time. And so I can't publish this like on a weekly basis. But even if I miss like a couple weeks or so, PreModern is still kind of like still there, which
Yeah.
is kind of nice. And so that's why it's been kind of fun to work on this newsletter.
That was initially why I decided I was going to cover Legacy, because I was like, well, I got other things to do. And then they were
Yeah,
just like, well, we're going to go into a design situation where we're just going to continue pumping out like pushed content constantly. And now like
yeah,
I feel
it's
like I'm on like a standard podcast where like every week there's some kind of a
I
new
know.
new deck, or there's news, or like it almost feels like Legacy has gotten to that point where like I'm thinking about rotation, and that's
Yeah,
one of the things you kind of get to avoid with pre-modern altogether.
yeah,
Nothing ever gets power creeped out. People just discover new like in this set, like defined like from what fourth edition to Scourge. It's
hmm,
super defined, but every like year or two, there somebody just goes, well, what if I do this, and it jukes the whole format around. I think
yeah,
Parfait was the last big like kind of people were like, oh, I just play like land tax and scroll rack and like get tons of value out of that, and that was a deck for the longest time. Obviously, it's seen a ban in the
yeah,
last I don't know, a year probably.
yeah,
But that deck didn't exist at the beginning of the format, and then there was like Full English Breakfast was like
yeah,
a deck that people were like, maybe, and then they were like, nope, this is the thing, and that dominated for a while. Everyone's been playing Red Deck Win since the beginning, but like, there's all these different iterations of you know what you want to play in that deck based on what the rest of the meta looks like. And I think
yeah,
having that sort of getting that sort of control where you're like, I have all the cards now, right? Like
yeah,
I have access to everything I need, and the things I need, for the most part, aren't super expensive. If you want to play survival, yeah, you got to go out and
yeah,
get survivals. And a lot of the format is either proxy friendly or gold border card friendly.
yeah,
Like I have
yeah.
a
That
full
that
set
part's
of
really great.
survival of the fittest from the Brian Hacker deck from
The
like
the the Brian Selden
the
deck,
Brian
right?
Selden, yeah, Brian Selden
Yeah,
deck. Because
yeah,
that's where I started getting into the format. I was like, I'm just going to buy all these like gold border decks.
yeah. I mean, like, I think you touched on a lot of reasons why I personally enjoy pre-modern, but like you said, like gold border is totally legal. And what's kind of great about pre-modern is that there are a lot of these legendary players who join in the format for various reasons, and they kind of make their own mark on it. And you mentioned Brian Selden, and he's actually like the reigning North American champion. He won Lobstercon last year.
Oh wow,
Yeah, he played a blue-white Landstill deck, and it was just cool because you'd be like, wow, it's thanks to this guy that we have gold border survival of the
yeah, of
fittest.
course,
And during one of the monthly webcam leagues, he actually played his gold border deck,
sick.
um, which is like quite a flex, right? Is
Yeah,
just to play your gold border
all
deck.
all of my deck is signed by me.
Yeah. So that's sweet. And then, there's also players, like you mentioned, Parfait was not on anyone's radar for a long time. And Raphael Caron, who was the original inventor of Parfait, joined PreModern a couple of years ago and started working on the deck because he was like, I love playing this deck in Vintage. It was kind of my baby for a long time. And at the time, people were like, "Oh, is this better than Landstill?" I mean,
Yeah,
like Standstill provides 3 cards. Like, why have 2 cards to reproduce what you can do in one? And so he worked on it for a long time, and then obviously a lot of other players contributed as well. But I don't know. I think it's kind of cool seeing these like Magic Legends work on
Yeah,
their decks,
yeah.
and it shows how the format can change, not necessarily drastically, but it still does have a lot of meta changes throughout time.
The other like great part about this is the nostalgia trip. Like seeing people do their
Yeah,
flexes as far. Like my fifth edition. Like all of the era, all the basic lands are Mirage.
yeah,
Cadaverous Bloom deck. Everything is within that era, right? But there's
it is
there's
sweet.
a million different ways that you can sort of flex that sort of stuff. Some
Yeah,
people will foil out their decks, that sort of stuff, or some people will just be like, I'm just going all new border, like and like as cringe as that is, like it's totally acceptable.
yeah, it's fun.
There's a lot of fun ways that you can sort of like customize who you are in the format through that, which is
Yeah,
super fun.
absolutely. I did want to touch briefly on the kind of like the meta of the large events, because I think the data
Yeah.
is like pretty interesting. So just real quick, um, the top decks by meta share are Burn at like 10%, and then Black White, which is a combination of Dead Guy Ale and Black White Control. Um, you know, Black White Control is also one of those decks that is fairly new. Francisco came up with or at least pioneered the deck and made it more popular. Um, and that one is kind of combined because a lot of people aren't able to differentiate the 2 decks quite yet in
No.
reporting, and
Yeah, I
so I
have no
just kind of
idea.
combined them. Yeah, they're very different, but they have a lot of similar cards, and so that's kind of next. Then Goblins at 8% meta share, Stiflenought, all flavors at 8%, the Landstill at 5, the Rock at 5%, Stasis at 4, Replenish at 4, and then Ponza Oath, which is kind of like a Terravore Oath deck at 4%. So those are like the most popular decks by appearances, which I think is like super interesting to look at when you're trying to predict like what you'll see. And then the next thing I wanted to share was kind of like, of those call it 5 events that I've kind of tabulated, I also put in the top 8 share to see, like, based on your meta share, you should theoretically have like a similar amount to top 8 share representation. Because if you have less, that kind of indicates that your deck is underperforming, right? Like if
Yeah.
Goblins is 10% of the meta, but only 2% of the top 8, that means that something is not converting well. And so, based on that, Burn is basically converting slightly above its meta share. So it's 10% of the meta, 13% of the top 8. So that's a good sign. Black White is slightly below. Goblins is about equal. Stiflenought is overperforming, which is good. Landstill is equal. Rock and the Stasis have not converted at all to top 8, despite being one of the most represented
Yeah.
decks, which is not a good sign. And then I'll wrap up by saying that Replenish is way overperforming. It's only 4% of the meta, but 13% of top 8. Tide Control and Elves are also way overperforming, which is a pretty good sign, because Elves is about only 2% of the meta, but 8% of
Mm.
top 8. So I think that this kind of information is interesting. Like if you're trying to predict what you'll see and you want to build your sideboard, or you're trying to get a sense of like what are the most powerful decks right now, that's like kind of an indication.
Yeah, and it's also kind of a great indication of the kind of analysis that you give in your emails.
Yeah, I think the newsletters are fun because they're kind of like a mix of some of it is more personal. Like I said, I do interviews with people or just community builders, but sometimes I do like to highlight a little bit more of the data behind the format. I try not to get like too in depth because for a large population of the format, they are just more interested in honestly community building. They love the format, they love the nostalgia, they want to jam fun cards and decks, and for the most part, I'm like that too. I am like a data analyst by trade, and so I do like looking at the numbers. But I like playing like brews and random stuff. I like talking to people about their experiences in the format, and so sometimes there's conversations about we should track all the data for all the MTGO leagues and all the Facebook webcam events. so that we can have an accurate representation in the meta. And then inevitably, there's some pushback because people are like, but why? Why do we
Yeah,
need
yeah,
all this
yeah.
data? Like, what's the point? Like, what if all
Do we
this
really
data?
want everyone to just be playing like
Yeah,
grief scam?
exactly. And so, like, if we end up doing all this data work and we find out that Stiflenought is the best deck in the format, and everyone starts playing Stiflenought, is like, what are we doing here? Like,
Yeah, that's
what's the
miserable.
point? And
You
so,
want to see different decks. You want people
yeah,
to be experimenting and stuff. That's the whole idea. That's why these things are low stakes too, is because it's like
yeah.
more it being low stakes offers so much more room for innovation.
I think so. It provides a different feel of the format. And so like I like having the data and I think it's interesting, but at the same point I don't want to get like too in the weeds and like, that I don't think that's the point of the format, but that's kind of the goal of the newsletters to try to like cover a lot of different aspects of the pre-modern format and community.
Cool. Well, Phil, it's been great having you on, man. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Always a good time, man. And I look forward to our conversation next year when we're talking about should Martin Berlin, the founder of the format, ban the Frost Bloom deck
Yeah, it's
because
got to
after
happen.
you sweep the Lobstercon event. So I'll start preparing my notes for that.
Yes, awesome. All right. Well, again, thank you everybody for listening. If you dug this content, like, subscribe. You can subscribe to our Patreon or Spotify or YouTube channels for ad-free listening as well as bonus content. And again, thanks everyone for watching. We'll catch you next time.
See ya.
Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.